Okay, everyone, welcome to our second to last Wednesday night talk of the semester. And tonight, I know a lot of people are going to be watching online afterwards, but tonight the talk is on the role of women in the church, and we are really blessed to have a wonderful speaker, Dr. Susan Timony. Dr. Timony is currently a professor at Catholic University of America. She got her doctorate in sacred theology from the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas in the city, or the Angelicum in Rome, and she served as the Secretary for Pastoral Ministry and Social Concerns for the Archdiocese, and that branch oversees any kind of pastoral ministry you really can think of in the Archdiocese, including campus ministry, and including, when I was in the Office of Worship, the Office of Worship. So Dr. Timony is my former boss, and Lisa's former boss as well. She is just a really great speaker, and we're so grateful and blessed, Dr. Timony, Susan, for coming back. So the mic is yours.
Thanks. Hey, good evening, everyone. It is really nice to be here. I taught my last class for the semester today, so I'm particularly happy. You guys have a bit more time to go, I think. But what a perfect time to have this conversation. So today the church celebrated the feast of St. Gianna Barata Molla, very much a modern woman in the church, a woman who balanced a professional career as a medical doctor with being married, with raising kids. She and her husband facing a really tough decision of treating her cancer and bringing her youngest child to term, and they opted just to put themselves completely in the hands of the Lord. And so the baby was born, named Gianna for her mother. Gianna died about a month later in her husband's arms. Her husband only died a couple of years ago, so very much got to spend a lot of time telling the story of St. Gianna. And then tomorrow we celebrate the feast of St. Catherine of Siena. So the second woman to be named a doctor of the church. Teresa of Avila was the first. They were named within a month of each other, following the Second Vatican Council in the late 1960s, as a way for the church to recognize the teaching that women had. So doctors of the church are people who their manner of living, and either their writings or their teaching or their preaching in some cases has some wisdom for the church in all time. And so at present there are 4 women doctors of the church, but Catherine of Siena was the second. So we're in the middle of these 2 celebrations. And so I want to talk in 2 ways about the role of women in the church. First, I want to talk about it in terms of the essential mission of the church, and then I want to talk about it in terms of the exercise of leadership within the church. So it's always good to start with reminding ourselves, right, that the essential mission of the church is to preach Christ and to invite people with an encounter with Christ, to an encounter with Christ, and to grow in holiness. Right? So the church's primary concern is to help people through the person of Jesus Christ, through active participation in the life of the church and the sacraments, to grow in holiness. And throughout the church's history, from the time that Jesus first invited women to follow him, to work with him as disciples, the church has always recognized in every age the model of women, and this, what Pope John Paul II liked to call the feminine genius. That is to say, the distinctively feminine way in which women lived out their discipleship and were preachers and teachers and healers and mothers and saints and doctors of the church. So we know the story, right, of the women who followed Jesus. We know that the most important, the definitive announcement of who Jesus was as the Messiah, as the Son of God, was entrusted to a woman, was entrusted to Mary Magdalene to go back and to tell the apostles that Jesus had risen from the dead. She's called by the church the apostle to the apostles, because the Lord entrusted her with this message, which was going to completely change everything. And then we know that Paul had a number of women who worked with him. If you think to the first Eucharistic prayer, which is the oldest Eucharistic prayer in the church, there's the part of the prayer where we name the first saints and martyrs, and there's a whole section of women who are named, Anastasia and Perpetua and Felicity. And so we have these examples that always in the mind of the church was this ability to put in front of people the model of women and the model of and of men, and so to highlight, right, this complementarity of what it means to be made in God's image and likeness, male and female. And then really in every age of the church, right, we can find saints, we can find women who made outstanding contributions in really interesting and varied ways. And I think that this is what's so fascinating. Many of them were lay women. Most recently, Pope Francis named St. Margaret of Castello a saint without going through the formal process. He felt like that her legacy and the devotion that people in that part of Italy have for her. She was a laywoman. She was born with what we would call today dwarfism. Her parents locked her away in a room and told people that she had died. They fed her, and unbelievably, they also allowed the priest to come and bring her communion. And so at 13, they took her to a church where they heard miracles were being performed and asked the Lord to heal her. She wasn't healed, and they left her there. So she lived in the street for many years. She became beloved of the community. She was taken in by the Third Order Dominicans, so remained a layperson but a Dominican, and had this outstanding ministry of charity and service. And then you have someone like Hildegard of Bingen, who already in the 13th century was writing music. She was called a preacher. Pope Benedict particularly wanted to recognize her ability to preach and teach, both within the convent and in the larger community. She was what we would call today maybe an herbal medicine practitioner. She was a midwife and named the fourth doctor of the church. So we have this pattern, right, that always in terms of the call to holiness, always in terms of the call to live fully what it means to be a disciple. The church has recognized the contribution of women, has continued to celebrate it. And in many ways, there was a period of time where the church was really the only place that women could be educated, the only place that they had the opportunity to write, the only place they had the opportunity to teach or to be leaders within, let's say, monastic communities or schools that the communities may have run. But even down to the time of the founding of our country, many of our first colleges, and women colleges particularly, were found by women's religious orders. And there was a really pivotal moment in the modern church in the late, either 95 or 2000. The United Nations was hosting a conference in Beijing on the role of women in society. And so the Vatican, as a non-voting member of the United Nations, was invited to send delegates. And there was a bit of a backlash. There was a bit of a concern among some people that the Vatican ought not to be invited because in not allowing women to become priests, they were inherently sexist. And so there was a petition that was put out, and people were signing it. But then, quite beautifully, another group of women leaders came to the fore and said, if we look around the world, if we look at the organization who does the most by way of the education and the health care of women, it's the Roman Catholic Church. And so they absolutely have to be at the table. And so that was a really beautiful moment at a period of time, right, when institutions were really being judged on this idea of the equality of men and women, of the leadership of men and women. And it was a chance to have outsiders be able to affirm the church's commitment to the service, to the education, to the caring, particularly in developing countries, for women and for children. So we've got that piece, but then we have to weave into the story the church's participation in the world, the way in which the church forms the world, and the church is shaped sometimes by the world. And St. John Paul II, in his letter to women called Mulieris Dignitatem, on the dignity and vocation of women, stated explicitly that, in fact, the church also has to recognize that in many cases, in many times, they failed to protect women. They failed to recognize the sin of sexism, but also the sin of the violent domination of women, be it in marriage and family life, be it in society in more general. And so he called out, in a sense, the organizations that were not doing their part in recognizing the dignity of women and in also calling women to their rightful place in leadership. And so that was also a really important moment. It was 1987 that letter was written. I think it's still the single best compilation of church teaching on this question that's easy to read and that begins with scripture and works its way through the way in which we think about it, again, both within the church and within the culture. And so it gave rise, right, to these questions of, well, then how does the church call women to leadership? How do women have the opportunity to exercise leadership in all parts of church ministry? And that really has been, I think, the work of the church over the last 2 or 3 generations. And so one of the questions, obviously, that needed to be addressed was, well, what about the call to ordination? Particularly as other Christian denominations, right, began to ordain women. So it was also St. John Paul II who, in another letter, laid out this idea of the diversity but the complementarity of the gift of what it means to be man and the gift of what it means to be woman in the church. And in particular, the meaning of gender. And so he looked to a couple of key points in terms of what he called the reservation right of ordination to men. And one was the very pattern of Jesus himself, right? So Jesus was very explicit in calling 12 apostles, in identifying those men who were going to be the leaders of the church, and from whom, particularly in the person of Peter, the leadership of the church would be entrusted and would flow. And he talked about the fact that in the person of Jesus, who preached and taught and ministered, that Jesus as a man, that masculine dimension of Jesus' humanity, in a way shapes his priesthood, shaped his work and his ministry that was important to the way that the priest is able, right, to serve Christ, and to be that, to act and serve in persona Christi. And so I think that particularly today, as we talk a lot about gender, as we talk a lot about what is it that men and women have in common, what makes us unique, what is masculinity, what is femininity, that Pope John Paul II wanted to contribute to the conversation that the distinction is certainly something that seemed to be intended by God in the sense that he made man and woman in his image and likeness, and that it's related to us in a sense, spirit, mind, and body. And so we communicate something through our bodies as well as through our minds of our masculinity and our femininity. And with regard to the priesthood, it's a really important, right, an essential dimension of what it means to be called to priesthood and to serve in persona Christi. And so he said at that time that he felt then the question was closed, meaning that there wouldn't be a continued sort of high-level kind of conversation about the calling of women to ordination. Since that time, there have been 2 formal studies sponsored by the Vatican on the relationship of the diaconate and women's role or potential for women to be called to diaconal service. So under Pope Benedict, the response to the research, the findings of the group who did the research, and then Pope Benedict himself was to say no. Pope Francis hasn't made a decision yet on it, but brought another group together to study it. And so the conversation continues in terms of the question of making sure that we're using women's gifts to the fullest expression in the life of the church. And so I think what's really important to think about And to think about when we see men and women in roles of leadership in the church, serving as ministers, right, in the apostolate, in the broadest sense of the word, to recognize that it doesn't mean that only priests have one set of gifts and women have another set of gifts. It rather means that in many cases, we share gifts that are common to ministry, the ability to teach, the ability to preach, the ability to help people reconcile, the ability to help heal people through the mercy and grace of the Lord. But we do it in very distinctive ways. And probably all of us, if we had time, could point to men and women in our experience in the church who have really touched us, who have shown us this leadership. As Father Conrad said, I was for a while in charge of overseeing the campus ministry in the diocese, and would have to say that I think your team here with Lisa, with Father Rob, back to Bishop Byrne, with Father Conrad, have a great example, right, of those gifts being exercised in a particularly feminine way and a particularly masculine way. I think this has something really exciting to offer the world and to offer the culture that's trying to figure out what it means to be man and woman, what it means to be man and woman together, what it means to be able to maintain that complementarity and that uniqueness and diversity of gifts, no matter what profession we're called to. One of the things I love about John Paul II's Mulieris Dignitatem is he talks about the need for women to be working in every field within the culture, to make their contribution across medicine and education and arts and politics, but to do it in a way that amplifies what it means to be a woman made in the image and likeness of God. I think we've been blessed here in the church in the United States in that we have for a long time, really since the time of the Second Vatican Council, welcomed women into positions of leadership in the church. In parish ministry, right, as directors of religious education, as coordinators of youth ministries, perhaps as director of liturgy and music. But I also want to say, too, in the church's mission of evangelization, sometimes when we get to this question, we tend to focus only on the parish and only on, let's say, the diocesan leadership. And we forget Catholic schools and Catholic healthcare agencies and Catholic charities and all of those other missions of the church where women may be the directors and women may be in positions of leadership in a lot of different ways. And so I always tell people we need to broaden that conversation and remember the enormous number of organizations that serve the mission of the church and in many times are led by women. But within the church, I want to speak a little bit of my own experience. I was really one of the first generation of women who served in parishes in pastoral ministry, right? Assisting the pastor with visiting the sick, coordinating RCIA, doing outreach to those who were distant from the church, right? Were inactive in the practice of the faith. And so had positions in 3 different parishes, working in that area of parish ministry and parish life. I remember the first job that I had, I was sent to visit a homebound woman, and it was the first time that she ever had a woman bringing her communion. And I could tell she was really nervous, and I was trying to put her at ease, and I said, well, let's pray a prayer that is really meaningful to you, that you really love. Let's pray the Memorare. Or I said, what would you like to pray? And she said, I'd like to pray the Memorare. And I was like, I don't think I know that by heart. So she just kind of looked at me like, you can't be serious. And I went back to the pastor and I was like, I think it ended okay, but it sure didn't start well. And so the next day he brought me this little like palm size copy of the Memorare that I could just pull out of my pocket. But we came to be good friends. And she said to me one time, she said, you know, it was beautiful that I learned that to receive Christ from someone who is a member of the community and who loves me is the gift that I want in being able to receive Christ. And then, of course, it was the pastor who came for reconciliation. It was the pastor who came to anoint her before surgery. And so you began to see this pattern of this ministry that could be increased by the priest and the layperson, in this case myself as a woman, working together. So parish ministry positions opened up. And then at the diocesan leadership, right, those coordinating offices at the diocese, for sure, there have been women in those positions, I'd say almost now for 25, 30 years, in some cases, maybe as far back as 40 years. And when I was there at the Archdiocese of Washington, in the senior leadership positions, so the cardinal has his auxiliary bishops, and then he has secretaries who oversee one part of the ministry of the diocese. So the finances, education, pastoral ministry, sometimes youth and young adult ministry may be separate. There was the facilities. And on that team, and the position of the chancellor, and on that team, for almost half of the time that I was there, we were the cardinal, 3 auxiliary bishops, 2 priests, and then 4 lay women and 3 lay men. And so to say that at the table with the archbishop, as he was looking at some of the most serious issues facing the diocese, you had that voice of both clergy and lay, and both men and women. And so I think when we talk about leadership within the church, we want to be able to talk about making sure that the leadership reflects the face of the church. And I think that the voices both of men and of women are heard, right? And that we have a chance, again, to bring those gifts to bear. From the time of Cardinal Hickey, so for almost about 25 years, the chancellor of the diocese was a woman. And the chancellor is, I mean, if we want to use the language of the world, right, is probably one of the most significant offices within the diocesan structure. In this case, the women happened to be attorneys, and so brought that particular skill set to the job. But it also meant that always women's voices were there, right, in the most senior, in a sense, of the senior positions. So I think one of the challenges we have as a church is we don't tell those stories. We're not often good at showing where women are serving in leadership positions. But I'd also have to say that sometimes as Catholics, we don't look beyond the priests and the bishop, right, to see the other work that's being done. And I think if we did look, we would see that there are so many women contributing their gifts. Some of you, if I asked you to think about your home parish, could possibly be in a situation where it's all lay women and 1 priest. And I don't think that's particularly good either, right? Like, we want to have that balance of lay men and lay women, but in many cases, there's far more women engaged in ministry than there are lay men. So I think a present challenge that we have, and something I always like to bring to the conversation, is let's broaden out what we mean by the church's mission so that we can see the breadth and the depth of the place and the way that women are serving. The final thing I would have to say is that I think if we're called to be made in the image and likeness of God, and if we're committed to wanting to become the person God created us to be, I certainly in my life have found that the church was the place that I did that, and that I was allowed to grow into and to use the gifts I feel that God gave me to serve his people. And I think that women ought not to feel like they can't become that person God created them to be within the life of the church, because we have these centuries of models of women who have found the same. So I might stop there. I'm really happy to take questions if there's something you want to pull out a little more. It's a broad topic, and so I'm never quite sure how to bring it together, but questions, comments, experiences of your own? Yeah. Sure, so I'll repeat the question in case it wasn't heard. So I talked about the relationship of the maleness to the person of Christ and then to men serving in persona Christi, and why that is. And I think it comes from this idea that we really do believe that gender shapes and informs the way that we experience the world and the way that we live out what it means to be made in God's image and likeness. And so to be masculine and experience that masculine genius, and genius in the philosophical sense, right? Meaning this expression, right? That's unique to men, and likewise the feminine genius of women. That Jesus was a man, right? He was fully human and masculine, and so his preaching and his teaching and the way that he ministered was shaped by that experience, right, of being a man. And so it would be then men who can most fully express in persona Christi the fullness of who Jesus was as fully human. So that sense that that gender isn't separate from, but is part of how we experience ourselves in mind and in body. Here's the way that I think is helpful to think about it in terms of not wanting to say there's only certain things men can do and only certain things that women can do. If you think about your parents, and if you think about the gift that we love that parents have of being nurturing, that many of us would say that our mothers and our fathers nurtured us in different ways. Right? There was a different expression to the way that we experience the nurturing love of our father and the nurturing love of our mother. And so there is a common gift that's really important to the vocation of parenting, but that is expressed out of the experience of what it means to be father and mother, what it means to be masculine and feminine. And so that we would say that that again, women have the ability to preach, they have the ability to heal, to help reconcile. It's different and expressed differently than that of the ministry of the priest. Yeah. Yes, so the question is, does the church, in a sense, need to live up to its own vision, or does it need to grow in gender equity? And yes, I would say absolutely. I think an important thing to remember, right, sexism is a sin, right? And so it's going to remain with us because it's part of the fallen condition. And the church itself ought to be really attentive to that. And so absolutely, there can be some, right, people within the church who are sexist, who would prefer not to have women present, right, who don't consult women, in a sense, to hear their voice, and that needs to be addressed and be made attentive. And I think, I would have to say, I think that that it can be a struggle in some places. But I also think that there's a language and there's a way that we can talk about complementarity from the tradition that maybe other organizations don't have the same language to be able to work with. And I would also say, too, so ironically, the place where there's been the most imbalance of men and women is the School of Theology and Religious Studies at Catholic University. So on the faculty right now, we have 31 men and 3 women. Full-time faculty members in 2021, right? So whereas the university was sort of one of the first at the moment, and so when I talk sometimes to my friends who are lawyers or my friends who are medical doctors, we have the same struggle sometimes, right? In terms of when it feels like an old boys club, right? Or when you recognize that men and women just look at things differently, and the richness of being able to take those different visions and work with them. Versus saying, well, we got to go with that one because that's the most number of people, right? Or that's the way the boss is looking at it. So yes, we have to struggle there, and I'd like to think we ought to be more faithful to the struggle because of what the Lord has entrusted to us. And I would also like to think that we can be a model, right, for others. I think that would be would be a wonderful contribution to make, but I don't think we tell the story well. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, obviously, we talk about a Marian dimension of spirituality, right? Of Catholic spirituality, and sometimes we talk often about the spiritual motherhood that we can experience in and through Mary, and so I think many men see in Mary that invitation to be nurtured, right, in a way that reminds us of our mother. And then likewise, there's that sense that in Christ we're all called to be disciples, right? So we certainly can live fully and express what it means to be a disciple of Christ. But I can see how you would be able to make that distinction in terms of how you relate, right, to Mary in a way that's different than the way in which you relate to Christ. And it's an interesting thing to reflect on, right? What part of Mary most helps you to grow in your understanding of what it means to love the Lord, of what it means to participate either in a spiritual motherhood or a biological motherhood. But I think sometimes that language seems confining rather than broadening out. But then how do you image that person of Christ? I'd say keep thinking about it and working through it. Yeah. That's a great question. So, will there be women at the Vatican Council, perhaps even religious sisters? So, at the Second Vatican Council, in the third and final session, when they took up the discussion of the universal call to holiness, in fact, there were one religious woman and one lay woman present. And certainly, in the time since when there have been synods, women have made interventions, as they're called, right, on the floor of the synod, but not voting members. So in the past 2 months, Pope Francis has appointed 2 women to 2 of the most senior positions within the congregations, which is a first, right? There are women that have served within the congregations at other levels. And one of them, I don't remember the exact title of the office, but she'll be part of the planning team and the overseeing of the future synods. And so we'll be there working in the shaping, right, of how the synod will come to be expressed. So that's an exciting appointment for sure. And I would say that that's a place that you can see that the church needs to grow, whereas here in the States, women have much more opportunities within the Vatican. They're still finding those ways, right, and those places to appoint women. The Vatican has a ton of commissions, and there are certainly women who serve on those commissions at very high levels. So I have a good friend who teaches at Providence College, and she's an expert on Islam. And she was on the Vatican's official delegation for dialogue with Islam. And so there's a theological commission, right, that reviews and oversees any of the major theological questions coming before the Holy Father. And there's certainly women representation on those. as well. But in terms of those office type positions and appointments, he seems to be using that as one way, right, to be able to look at that, making sure the gifts are there and the reflection of the face of the church is there. Yes. That's a great question. So the question is, how do you balance the wanting to continue to work for gender equity, gender equality, but also being obedient to the teaching of the church? And I think it comes first and foremost in prayer and in remembering what is it a means to the end? Like, what's the end purpose of where the inequity is and how it needs to be changed and for what reason. But I think it's not being afraid to raise our voices. It's not being afraid to say, hey, I look at this situation completely differently than you do. So we kind of need to stop and talk about how we perceive the situation at hand and what prejudices we may bring to it. I think that's really important to do. I think that one of the things that I would love to see in the conversation is to broaden the way that we have the conversation beyond the issue of women's call to ordination, in the sense that we can, not that we shouldn't talk about it, but if we talk only about that, then we leave out all the other ways and all the other places women can make contributions and aren't at the table and should be at the table. And so I think it's also important to be able to say, well, where do we think we need the gift that women have to bring? And let's make sure we can put women there to be able to share that gift. So to constantly be asking ourselves, how does it serve the mission best, and what are the ways in which women can help serve that mission, and to keep struggling with it, right? To keep asking yourself how it makes sense. What more do you need to understand? I mean, I think God loves a good wrestling, right, on a particular issue. And to do it in a way that you say, but Lord, I want to be open to understanding and to seeing the truth of this particular teaching. And so it challenges us, right, intellectually and spiritually, to be able to continue to give ourselves and to trust the wisdom of the church, but also to say, hey, but in the meantime, let's correct those things that are not part of the church's mission, and that need to be changed and corrected. Mm-hmm. Right. So the question is that sometimes it can feel like the pressure to have children and to raise children is put on the woman, and particularly the church's emphasis on that, and can it feel sometimes not life-giving, but maybe life-taking. So I think that that Pope John Paul II certainly talked a little bit about this idea that, he talks about the fact, first of all, that the gift of motherhood, right, is an amazing gift. I mean, for man and woman to be co-creators with God the Creator is in fact an amazing gift. And it would seem that some of the natural gifts of women were given by God in order to be able to nurture children, right? So to say that they have the lead in this for a long time was the way that the church thought about it. The call, obviously, the church is fully supportive of fathers, right? Being active in the raising of children and recognizing it really does need to be a partnership. The church, for a long time, even as far back as the 40s and 50s, always advocated for a living wage so that a family could make the decision for one person to stay at home if they thought it was best for their family, right? So they were sort of very pro the idea of being able to make sure families had what they needed to raise their children well. That said, I think he opened up the language of this idea of a spiritual motherhood to say that obviously not all women are called to be mothers. But the nurturing is a particular gift that has been so fruitful in the life of the church in a lot of ways. So thinking of the nurturing dimension of education, right? Or thinking of Gianna Baratamola talked about the way in which she had a chance to nurture these babies right into young human beings through good health and through taking care of disease. So I think it's the recognition that in a sense there's no greater call in many ways than the call to be a parent, to bring life into the world, to nurture this individual unlike no other individual that God created. But it ought to come out of a sense of a vocational awareness that this is what God is asking of me and this is what I'm called to do, and that I have the support, right, of a family and a community to help me to do that. But I don't think that the church would ever intend, if that wasn't the vocation you felt like you were called to insist, right, on that, but rather to be able to discern and affirm what it is that you feel that you've been called to. These were great questions. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
And I just want to thank, Susan, thank you so much again for coming, and thank you everyone for such great attention and questions. And these are questions that, we are blessed to have many women working in this community here who do so much more really than I do in so many ways. And so, talk to Lisa or Anne about these issues too, if you want to have another perspective or a really good and valuable one. We have one more talk, like I said, in our little series here, and that's going to be next week. We have Craig Joring, who is going to be talking about service to the poorest of the poor. He runs a lot of missions in Mexico to care for those who really are on the streets, and what it means as a Christian to have the call to serve the poor. And what it means to really have a heart to do that, as opposed to just kind of it's something I've added into my routine. And normally, in normal time, we would be going down to work with Craig to serve the poor regularly on mission trips, and hopefully we'll be doing that again soon. So that'll be next week, same Catholic Terps time, same Catholic Terps network, and then that will be our last one, single tier for the semester. But there's always time. You can always, if you have any questions or anything you want to talk about, you can come talk to me, to Lisa, to Matt, to Anne, and we're here for you. So thank you guys. God bless you, and thank you again, Dr. Timony.